And lastly, I want to introduce our speaker. Come on up, Mike. This is Mike Dominguez. You know him as an industry leader, but you're going to know him in a new capacity. This is Mike, the newest member of CMCA's leadership team.
Thank you. She hooked me in. How can you say no when you're here? So it is a privilege to serve, and I'm happy to do it, so thank you for the time. Look, I know these are unusual times, and I'm going to go through, and something I've been doing over the last couple of days is kind of giving a state of the industry and giving some perspective. We will talk a lot about COVID-19 and what's going on with the current situation, of course, but that's not the entire industry, and I want to be able to talk about it and put it into some perspective. But we do know unusual circumstances. I'll get to that, but in talking about the state of the industry, there's much more going on. So let me start with what we have been talking about for some time, and is the advancer working? There we go. Let's go back. Oh, no. Try again. Do I have the wrong one? It's quite all right. Thank you. We'll try that again. There we go. All right. Now we're talking. Look, when we talk about what's going on, it's interesting. Something I was talking about before the situation that's been going on over the last 4 to 5 weeks was what we are dealing with as far as understanding what's really happening through the media and information that's being fed to us. And again, this was long before the situation we were looking at now. And the reason I talk about that is that we're living in an environment, and specifically where we are in an election cycle and an election year, we're living in an environment that it's important to understand. You need to do your homework, you need to do some research, you need to understand that in a lot of capacities we've lost journalism and we have media. We have people giving you a point of view versus understanding and giving us really what are the facts and what's happening on. And that's not a bashing of the media, it's a 24-hour news cycle. The days that we used to sit around and wait for the 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock evening news to actually get our news report and then move on are gone. So you have 24-hour cycles of people trying to feed information, and a lot of that information is not always completely accurate as how it's presented. And I don't want to say it's fake news. The interesting thing is it's not the complete story, if that makes sense. We tend to read headlines, we tend to read bite-sized information. That goes through social media. That tends to be the challenge. I'll talk about that a little bit further later in the presentation, but I want to show you a clip, and this clip is from Denzel Washington. Denzel Washington was on the red carpet of Fences, and it was his new movie that was coming out, and this reporter made the mistake of asking him a question about a fake news story about him. And this was his response that I think is so eloquently done and well positioned, that I'll show you this and we'll talk a little bit more.
If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed.
So what do you do?
That's a great question. What is the long-term effect of too much information? One of the effects is the need to be first, not even to be true anymore. So what a responsibility you all have to tell the truth, not just to be first, but to tell the truth. We live in a society now where it's just first. Who cares? Get it out there. We don't care who it hurts. We don't care who we destroy. We don't care if it's true. Just say it, sell it.
By the way, it was the last question that reporter asked him that night. It was over. And I'm a big fan of Denzel because he is eloquent, he is well educated on issues, and you heard this, and it's been something he's been championing for some time. He's concerned at how the information goes out. You know, the University of Texas recently did a study. They took graduate students, and who supposedly well-educated, well-read graduate students. They took 50 stories. 10 of them were factual, 20 of them were false, leading towards a Democratic point of view. 20 were false, leading towards a Republican point of view. They labeled them as fake stories, pushed them through social media streams, and these well-educated graduate students could literally only discern fact or fiction 43% of the time. And it was labeled a fake story. What the study ended up showing is if you lean a certain point of view or you lean a certain way, you tend to want to believe it even if you intuitively know it's not true. You have a filter. We all have a filter. That's what the study was saying, and that's where it's problematic today, that everybody throws out the reel, they throw out the bait, and we take it and we run. And it's interesting because when you look at the surveys will tell us less than 20% of us trust the media today. Yet we take a news story or a headline and we run it through our social media feeds like it's gospel. That's an issue. And that is a challenge we have in today's society. And I'll give you an example. One of the things we've talked about is when you take a look, I'm going to the slides now. One of the things that we'll talk about is the retail apocalypse. And the retail apocalypse is something we've all heard about. You've probably been reading about it. Basically, brick and mortar stores are dead. That's what we've been hearing. Actually, it's not true. But the media has convinced us that this is the case, because actually, if you look at the actual data, 90% of all sales still come from a brick and mortar store. 90%. Less than 10% are coming from online, and by the way, that is flatlining. Actually, this month may not be true, but at least right now, this is the normal data. And here's what's interesting. What we have found is that even online, there are certain things you will buy as a consumer online. There are certain things you won't. There's certain things you want to go do yourself. We're finding it right now. You know what you will do? Grocery shopping. Doesn't mean that you can't get it delivered. You want to check your own produce. You want to get your own produce. You want to pick your own cut of meat when you're actually selecting the meat. That's just something innate in us as human beings. And what we're finding right now, retail is not dead. Retail is separated. We have luxury and we have luxury and discount. What's disappeared is the middle. And what do I mean by that? The Nordstroms, the Louis Vuittons, the Tiffany's of the world, they're doing well. And you look at the discount, TJ Maxx, Marshalls, Target, Walmart, they're doing well. You know who's dying? Dillard's, Macy's. The middle tier is what's struggling. And we have this split and this divide. And by the way, we have the same divide in the hotel business today. And I'm going to show that to you as well. But literally, you've gone into luxury and discount. And if you need no further proof that brick and mortar is not dead, Amazon, an online retailer, is opening up 200 physical stores this year. I'm going to say it again. An online retailer is opening up 200 physical stores. It is not an issue of whether it's physical or whether it's online. It's a combination of both and using good analytics to make a good product. And the reason I think this is important is there's all kinds of changes around us, and I think it's important for us to understand you need to change your models, and you need to change business models. You need to change your look and how you see things. And I use an example like Fortnite. Fortnite was a game that was released not too long ago, and many of you may have heard about Fortnite. It was literally the largest selling free game of all time. And you got to listen to what I just said. Free game that actually earned $4 billion. No price of entry and earned a ton of money. Your kids played it, your nieces or nephews played it, you might have played it even if you don't admit it. Somebody was playing the game because it was very, very popular. And the reason it sticks with me is at its peak, the only thing outpacing it was Netflix. Again, it raised more revenue than any free game ever released. And what's interesting is at its peak, it was bringing in $318 million a month. How do you do that on a free game? No price of entry, but once you're in, you want to change your costume, you pay 99 cents to change your costume. 99 cents times 20 million people adds up really quick. That's where they made their money. So why am I telling you this? When I look at what this does, we are raising a society today, or living in a society, and when I say that, this has nothing to do with generations. We are living in a generation. And that means everybody, all age groups in this generation. We're living in a generation that we are removing a price of entry. I guarantee you many of you in this room have stopped having a cable bill, completely cut cable out of your life because you have subscriptions and you can get what you want and where you want it and how you want it. That's the world we're moving into. It used to be you didn't have a choice. You had to get into cable if you were going to see any TV. That's not the world we're living in today. What we're living in today is I can get what I want and when I want it, and I'm only going to pay for the value I see. So let's talk about meetings. I'm on the board of ASAE. That's the American Society of Association Executives. We have a program called XDP. It's the Experience Design Project. So this is kind of a laboratory of meetings. We invite people in. 2 years ago, we went to all meeting planners and we said, by the way, you get to come to the meeting for free. At the end of this, no registration fee for this. At the end of this, we're going to send you a bill, and you're going to pay us what you think it was worth. It is putting all the pressure on the people organizing the event, and it is basically saying, I don't need to send a satisfaction survey because what you pay me is going to tell me if you were satisfied. And when we came to the end of this, you know what we found? About a third of the people paid us more than we asked. About a third of the people paid us the reg fee, and about a third of the people paid us less. The economics worked out almost identical, but you know where our satisfaction was? Through the roof, because people actually paid for what they found valuable. The reason this is so important today, I'm telling every association, and this is the critical part, if you are not thinking membership models today, you are going to struggle in 5 years, because membership models are changing. And it's no longer that I'm paying you to be a member. That is going to be an option. But there may be people that just want research. There may be people that just want opportunities into the network. It's going to look different. It's going to be personal. And we are raising a generation and living in a generation that we get what we want, where we want it, and how you want it. Think of a subscription model base. You are paying for the content you want, and you're willing to pay for that. All organizations are going through this today. And it's an interesting one because it's perplexing. Look, I'm a big fan of John Chambers. He was the CEO of Cisco for 25 years and realized that the average length of tenure for a CEO of a Fortune Top 500 tech company is 6.5. He lasted 25, and he lasted 25 because he kept reinventing his company. He realized the world was changing and he needed to change with it. Well, John has a couple of things, and I like to share with people. He has a great way of pulling this together. Anybody who's worked for me has heard this 100 times. Disrupt or be disrupted, but disruption is coming to your life. Make the choice. You can either disrupt or you will be disrupted. And that means your business models. That means how you look at your work every day, how you deal with your employees. It's one of the reasons we're going to talk about leadership later. Disrupt or be disrupted, but disruption is coming. I tend to irritate a lot of transportation companies in our industry because I tell them, if you're mad at Uber for taking away business, by the way, they don't own a single vehicle. They are a tech play on something you didn't do very well. They are a tech play on the friction that existed between us and being able to get transportation. And for the hoteliers that to this day are still talking about trying to get our customers back from an OTA, from an Expedia or Travelocity of the world, they don't own a single hotel room. They were a tech play on something we did not do very well as an industry. We're all now dumping millions of dollars into our technology to make it more efficient, to catch up to the companies that disrupted us. Great example of disrupt or be disrupted, but disruption's coming to your life. The other thing that John talks about, it's really simple. If you're going to succeed today, you need to think like a startup. You know how startups think? They move really fast and they fail often. You know how most of us think? We move really slow and we're risk averse. You know how associations think? We move even slower and we take very little risk. That's a challenge in today's world because it's not a model that survives. And here's the most telling stat, and it applies to any room I'm speaking to. It's research they did. And the research used to be 25%, it moved to 40%. And I hope it makes you nervous because it makes me nervous a little bit every day. 40% of you in this room will not be relevant in any significant way in the next 5 years because you can't change fast enough. Doesn't mean you're not going to be in business. Doesn't mean you're not going to be around. You're just not going to be relevant to the conversation anymore. And that's an important piece of the puzzle when you look at everything that's going on. So let's look at some of the other pieces to this because it's dynamic. And when you look at, I need the slides again, there we go. When you look at these changes are moving into our industry as well. So let me go through our industry. And I should, before I go through there, when I say you won't be relevant, let me give you an example to tell you everybody's at risk. There's a Yale professor, Richard Foster, and Richard Foster does an analysis of the S&P 500. So if you look at the Standard & Poor's 500, it's an index on the street. Interesting thing is, if you were on the S&P 500 in the 1920s, you would have actually remained on the index for 67 years. In 2010, you will only remain on the index for 15 years. And by the way, 75% of the S&P 500 today, 2/3 of all the companies that are the biggest, baddest companies around will not be on the index in the next 12 years. Everybody is at risk. And by the way, it doesn't mean those companies are out of business. They're just not relevant to the conversation anymore. They're no longer one of the best companies around. Somebody else has taken their spot. Jeff Bezos with Amazon, at an all-employee meeting, he brought everyone together and he told all his employees, we will be out of business in 30 years because he believes all big businesses will fail. And I know I say that and people are like, it's Amazon. They're never going to go out of business. I guarantee you Sears was saying the same thing in the 1980s. When they were the largest retailer in the world, we used to judge the economy based on their performance, and they are out of business today. The issue is he believes it because I think it's true. And what he says is the bigger you get, the slower you swim. Klaus Schwab, who's the founder of the World Economic Forum, he has a great quote. His quote is really simple. In today's world, it's not the big fish that eats the small fish. It's the fast fish that eats the slow fish. The question is, how fast are you swimming? And whatever your answer is, I can tell you it's not fast enough. That's the issue. And that's the change. And we have dynamic change in our industry as well. And when you see this, this is all I have to put a caveat, because I think it's important to note. This is all pre-last 4 weeks. But it's important to understand that we were in a really good place until this, which makes it easier to come out of it. And that's an important perspective for you to understand. So that's why I want to show this, because I needed to show that our longest run in the hotel business as far as RevPAR growth. RevPAR in its simplest terms to everybody is rooms revenue. Rooms revenue and positive growth was 1990 to 2000 was the previous record, where we actually grew 111 out of 112 months. We had exceeded that as of January of this year. We were already at 113 out of 117 months of positive RevPAR growth during the cycle. We know we're going to have a dip here in February, March, and April, but that doesn't mean we won't come roaring back in May, June, and July. So there could still be some positivity in this cycle. But it's understanding we've been on a tear like we've never seen. That's the important part of this. And what has really shifted, and this is going to be good for the hotels, what has really shifted during this cycle is that it's the transient business, not the group, that has driven this. Transient is all non-group business. Doesn't matter how you book, those are our segments that we look at. But when you're looking at this, you're either a group customer or you're a transient customer. What you will see is that the transient customer has grown and grown tremendously, and the split, the percentage of transient business in a hotel has never been greater. Now, why am I saying that's good news? You're going to have a lot of pent-up demand with people that have been at home, shackled for 3 to 4 weeks. When they get to summer vacations, when they get to planning the rest of the year, we should see a spike in this business. And what's important to know, 85% of all the traffic in the United States is domestic, not international. So yes, international is going to have some downturn, and we get that. Do you know after the SARS epidemic, we actually decreased in international traffic by 6%, but we grew demand in the United States by 4%, because we all started traveling more after that epidemic. So the reason I say this right now, I bet nobody in this room is taking a trip to Europe this summer. That is going to be most Americans. And even if you had people that were thinking of going to Europe, they're probably going to stay home. And if they stay home, that's going to be a nice lift for our hotels that are going to be coming through a really bad time. And we get that. That's the positive out of all of this. We should be able to see some of this. It's not, hey, we're just turning on the keys and everything gets back to normal. You're going to have people that aren't going to go to Asia, and they're not going to go to Europe in the short term. I don't mean ever, but I just don't see that happening through the summer period, which is the high travel period for most people. That's going to be really positive for us as an industry, and it's going to be needed, by the way. This is what was happening. It's just showing you what 2019 looked like. Group was mirroring what we saw in 2018. We had 7 all-time record years. This is just showing you we had seen no decline whatsoever, and transient was through the roof off 7 all-time record years. That dotted line is 2019, the teal dotted line. So you can see we were exceeding old numbers that were all records, telling us the world was set up pretty well for us as a hotel industry. This is the split I was telling you about. If you look at this chart, look at the difference in demand growth by upscale and luxury versus all other segments. And it's not that all other segments aren't growing, they're just not growing at the same pace as our luxury and upscale. This is an important chart because you can see that as we start to slip, luxury is going to slip, but it has more room to give than some of the discount. And that is the discount areas where I do think there's going to be a little bit of a rate war. You're going to have people, these are the shoppers. I always joke about this. I am the person that one time my wife got me up on a Black Friday, and I was at the store at 6 a.m. with my cup of coffee, and I came home and I said, I will pay full price forever to never have to do that again. Now I have friends and relatives that that's a game for them. They enjoy it. I did not enjoy that at all. And I was okay to say, I will never do it again. I will just pay for it and I am fine. The discount shoppers, this is a game for them. They like to find the deal. The rush is in finding the deal. That's where we have a separation in the world today. And a lot of that's driven by technology because it's allowed us to do that. There's also a study by STAR, and they do a MAP study. It's a meetings assessment program. And what they take a look at is it's the largest study of the meetings industry that we see. And what they look at is top destinations for the future. Just wanted to point out, your top 10 over the next 2 years are the usual suspects. The one thing I point out to people, you know what's noticeably absent from the chart? Nashville. And I explain to people, it's not that Nashville's not around. Nashville's in the top 15 still, just no longer the top 10. Nashville had a new convention center. They had all these new hotels. You know what they had? Availability, and they were affordable. You know where they are today? They're expensive and they're full. And that is why they're no longer in the top 10. And that's not a knock on Nashville. They've earned it. They are acting like a first-tier destination today. Guess who's in the list today? Austin. Guess who's expanding their center and has a lot of new inventory? Austin. Guess who's probably not going to be in the list in 2 years? Austin. Because they're going to be full, no longer available, so they won't be a hot spot as we move forward. So that's the demand side of the equation. Again, before we got to the last couple of weeks, what I wanted to show you, and this is really why I am hopeful that as painful as this will be, it won't be as painful as other cycles. And what you're going to see here, this is a demand and supply curve for us. And when I look at this, the dark blue is demand, the teal is supply. And what I wanted to show you, I told you 1990 to 2000 was the closest thing to what we're seeing today. And what I wanted to show you is when you look at this, yes, the lines invert. That doesn't matter. You don't have to study it that hard. All I want you to know is, or notice, look at how tight the lines were together through the entire cycle. Whether they inverted or not, they stayed close. Look at this cycle between 2010 and 2019. There is so much separation. The demand so outpaced supply. We do not have a supply glut in the industry. That is the hopeful side of lower demand without supply that we have to make up, as we have during other cycles. And I'm going to show you another chart that really spells this out because I think it's important. As of May of 2019, we had flipped. Supply had finally started to overtake demand, but you can see the lines were so tight together, it wasn't going to be making an impact. It wouldn't have been anything that was material to the overall numbers because they're too close together when it's all said and done. And this is probably most impactful for anyone planning meetings or in the meeting side of it. We weren't building meeting space through this cycle. And if you look at this, this shows you the amount of meeting space that we opened in the United States by millions of square feet since 2000. And you can see from 2000 to 2010, we opened up a lot of space and then we went off the cliff. And we didn't have a lot of space being built. And you can see we're starting to recover a bit, but even where we recovered, if you go back to 2000 to 2010, 7 out of those 10 years beat what we did right now as far as new meeting space coming into the market. That's a challenge for us. So we do have more demand in meetings. We don't have enough space in meetings because we're not building a lot of them. Do you realize 70% of everything that's been built in the hotel industry over the last 5 years are limited service hotels? A Hampton Inn and a Loft Hotel, a Courtyard by Marriott, you see them popping up everywhere. What you don't see popping up are the big boxes. And that's really because this was a financial crisis and those banks weren't going to be able to loan on those type of projects. We're starting to see it come back. That's where you're starting to see some of that space come back, but for a long period of time it wasn't there. So let me show you that. I'm going to get past that. Here is the forecast as we were moving forward. I want to point out most of this doesn't apply anymore. We know that, but you can see occupancy. This is the important part. Occupancy has been sitting at 66% occupancy in the United States. Do you know we've never achieved 66% in history, ever? We've never been this high in occupancy. And the interesting part is our occupancy long run average historically over the last 30 years is 62%. And we're occupying 66%, and we're so much larger than we've ever been. Just means there's a lot of demand out there, and that's real positive for us. What I would take a look at is we know 2019 is not going to stay at 66% with what we're experiencing, but I wouldn't be surprised if 21 and 22 come back to those numbers once we get through this cycle. This is just showing you these are current travel indexes. As we were getting into the year, everything was normal. We were seeing real positivity. You can see across the board, everything was up. International was already flat. International was not something that was growing for us. So we know we're going to have a decline in international, but everything else was still steady, which was real positive for us. And then this just shows you our CTI index. And all I'm trying to show you is November, December, there was no change. Everything was consistent. We were moving into the year. Everything was really, really positive. And then we have this. And then we have another crisis that kind of takes it off. I want to show you the economics and frame that for you as well. When we talk about the economy, this is an important part. Christine Lagarde, I have a tremendous amount of respect for. She runs the International Monetary Fund. And you can hear, and I agree with her, we take a look at measurements today and they don't add up and they don't quite correlate. We're using old metrics in a new world and they don't always apply. And what she's saying is we don't measure things well today. So let me give you an example. Unemployment has consistently decreased over the last few years, and you've seen that. But yet we didn't feel it in the economy. Well, unemployment is not a measurement of employment. Unemployment is a measurement of those that have applied for unemployment benefits. And the reason that's important and why it doesn't always apply in these times, this recession we went through was the largest recession we've ever seen for the longest long-term unemployment in history. The average length of unemployment during this cycle was 32 months, and benefits stop at 24. Which means as the unemployment number continued to come down, it didn't mean people were working. It just means they couldn't get benefits anymore, which actually compounded the issue. That's what she's talking about. Unemployment and looking at an unemployment metric works in most circumstances. It doesn't work when you're in a cycle that has the longest long-term unemployment we've ever seen. That's where we have to make sure that we're looking at the right numbers. So let's look at perspective and context. This is the hotel industry. Room nights per capita dating back to 1987. You can see how far north we are of any previous cycle we've ever been on. And this is the one that's always been encouraging for me. When you look at this chart, the bottom line is GDP, and the upper line is literally spending on actual lodging. And what you'll see is our GDP, our gross domestic product, has grown at 91%. During that same cycle, the amount of money we spend as consumers on travel and lodging has grown at 271%. We are a generation of travelers. We believe travel is our right. We want to explore the world. We are a generation of experiences. We want to experience the world. That's not going to change once we get through this cycle. We just got to get through the cycle we're in right now. And the other thing that's important, and I'm going to give you some context, and I said we're in a much better place than we've been in the past going into a downturn, is the numbers may look the same, but they're very different. Right now, it's the yellow balloon as we entered into this cycle. We're not all gray balloons. And why I want to point that out, occupancy. Occupancy is at a high, as you can see, dating back into the 1980s, like we've never seen. So are we going to decline with what's going on? Absolutely. Do we have room to give? Absolutely. We're coming from the highest point, not the lowest. We're coming not even from a midpoint. It's the highest point in history and well past our normal high. The other thing I would point out is when you look at RevPAR, again, this is rooms revenue. Look at where we are today. Yes, hotels are going to hurt in the short term, but we're in a good position to be able to overcome this long term. If this turned into a much longer term scenario, that's a different conversation. When we get to coronavirus, I'll tell you, we're probably looking at a 4 to 6 week period max. And I'll tell you why. There's some real data that you need to look at that would understand that's kind of the timing, but we'll take a look at this. So this is the most important chart. And what I wanted to show you is these gray bars here. The gray bars are every recessionary period over the last 40 years, 30 years. And what I wanted to show you is that this blue line is supply. And what you will see is during the last two cycles, where we had a downturn in 2001 and we had a downturn in 2000, during the cycles, we had a spike of supply right before or during the recession. And the reason that's important, where you see this dotted line, you have to make all of that space up. You have to make up all that new inventory with decreasing demand. That is why it was so painful and so hard to get through. What's encouraging right now, we have no spike. Even if we get, and we will get into a little bit of a downturn, we don't have this glut of supply that we're having to consume. At the same time, demand is slipping. And it doesn't mean it's not going to hurt. It's just not going to hurt as badly. That's the important part. And that is where I think context matters in putting things into perspective on where we are as we went off the cliff. This is also encouraging for, and we hear people are going to be in short-term unemployment situations. We know that, and that's going to be painful. I'm thankful that the government is doing some things right now to extend those benefits and to make sure that the people that are disrupted in the short term will be taken care of. This is the important part. Right now, this first chart here shows you your debt, consumers' debt, as a percentage, consumer debt as a percentage of disposable income. The point I want to make is we're at an all-time low. And if you look at 2008, we were at an all-time high. So we had more debt than we had ever seen in 2008 when we fell off the cliff. That created the economic freakout. What we have right now is low debt. That's a really good place for us to be. And then more importantly is right here, we are at a savings rate we have not seen since 2000. So you had a consumer that was saving more with less debt as things have kind of pumped the brakes, which tells us the consumer is in a much better position right now to actually weather this just a bit, as long as it's short term. That's an important perspective to understand with what's going on. And candidly, if everybody is isolated at home, they're not going to be spending much either. That's the other part of it. Yes, it's this trickle down and we're all being impacted, but people are going to be spending less at home, theoretically, unless they're shopping on Amazon because they got nothing else to do. But more than likely, they should be spending less at home when it's all done. This was the economic indicators coming out of January and February. You could see everything was positive. Just again, before we hit the brakes, everything was in a really good spot, and that's an important piece of it. Consumer confidence was at an all-time high. It's taken a dip, but surprisingly, it hasn't crashed. And I think that's important. The markets were responding today, and I'll tell you why, because of some news that was out there. The market was on a tear. We can actually have a moment of silence because the bull run is officially dead. The bull run died a week ago, and it was the official end of the longest bull run we have ever seen in our lifetime. And the bull run, if you don't follow the markets, you either have a bull market or a bear market. This was the longest bull market we have ever seen in basically in history, not just our lifetime. If you don't follow the markets, I always say, think of the animals. A bull charges and a bear hibernates. The bull has been charging for 11 years. And it is the end of an 11-year bull run. Technically speaking, you have to drop 20% from your 52-week high in the market, which we did. We were sitting starting this morning at 30% below our 52-week high. So we are officially in a bear market. Here's the good news. When that sounds really depressing, the average bear market lasts 18 months. The average bear market. Much shorter and much longer bear markets. This should be a little bit of a shorter bear market. The longest, or the bull runs on average, last 7.5 years. So we just got to get through it. I always say it's kind of like dieting if you follow the market. We all diet, and then we lose the weight, and then we have to go back on a diet because we put it back on. That's the economy. When we get fat and happy, we need a correction. And that's going from a bull market to a bear market. The only thing you're asking is it the keto diet going to fix it, or am I going to have surgery? Because that tells you how severe it's going to be as far as the diet. If it's a keto diet, it will be short-lived and we'll be able to move on. I'm not predicting it. I'm hoping, and I think all indicators will tell us once we get through this, that this will be a short-lived bear market and we'll be able to run again. And that is really the hope in the market side. GDP had been growing and growing consistently, which was good for our economy. I already talked about the markets. Here's the important part. All verticals were coming along for this market. It wasn't just technology. It was every sector had come along on this bull run, which was a real positive for us. The markets were all up coming into the year. And then something that has not been talked about heavily unless you're really paying attention, because all the news has been about COVID-19. The 2,000-point drop we had last week in the market had everything to do with oil and nothing to do with the virus. And if you have not been paying attention, the United States is the second largest contributor of oil to the world supply. Most people don't know that. It's under the radar. All estimations, we would be number one by 2021, overtaking OPEC, by the way, as far as providing more oil. A lot of that came from fracking in the middle of the country. We have 1.5 million jobs that are dependent on oil and energy, so this is an important sector to our economy. The Russians have been trying to bury the price of oil And the reason they were doing that is because fracking is much more expensive than drilling. They've been trying to hammer the price of oil and lower it so that the U.S. would be impacted. The U.S. has so far survived, and we've been able to get through it. The fight that happened last week was the Saudis and Russians were sitting at a table together. The Saudis wanted the Russians to pull back supply because we have too much supply for the amount of demand in the world, and that's what's taking prices down. The Russians walked away from the table, did not want to hear it, did not want to deal with it, and the Saudis intentionally sank the price of oil to try to bury the Russians. The Russians' economy, by the way, 60% of it's dependent on oil and on the price of oil. So they're trying to bury the Russians. Unfortunately, caught in the crosshairs, it's us, the United States. Has nothing to do with us. The Saudis aren't trying to bury us. They are trying to bury the Russians. And it's a game of chicken. It's who's going to last. And if you look at it, this is what happened to what the Saudis intentionally did to the price of oil. I always say oil has to be like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Not too high, not too low, needs to be just right. Right now, it's way too low. And at $30, our frackers need oil to be at close to $55 a barrel to be able to make money. So right now at $30, they're losing money. Why does that matter, and why did the markets crash? The markets crashed because your oil and industry crashed, and then your banking sector crashed as far as stock pricing. Why? Because there's a lot of debt coming due from the frackers, and if it stays at $30 a barrel, you're gonna have a lot of bankruptcies. You're gonna have a lot of people just literally eating the debt, and that debt's gonna be eaten by the banks. That's all underlying, and we don't hear about it because all you've been hearing about is a virus. So it's an important one to understand. That's been a big hit on the market. It's worth 2,000 points in the market for sure. Employment's been good. I already told you about unemployment. We continue to roll out really great jobs on a monthly basis. That was the headline from February. We had 273,000 jobs, new jobs that were created in February right as we were rolling into March. The only positive to that is, again, we were in a really good place as this hit. And it's better to be in a good place as you get into a major downturn versus to be in a place that's you're having to catch up already. So there is some positivity in that when you're taking a look at our positioning. Here's the other thing that's been going on, and this has been a positive. Wages have been growing. And the media is not telling you that heavily. Wages have been growing over the last 2 years. And by the way, it's non-supervisory wages that are growing, not supervisory. It is the people that are in line jobs that are growing at a faster rate than anywhere else. The important part of this, and if there's any silver lining, the service industry had more jobs open than we had people to fill them. We've had 800,000 jobs we've been trying, and it's floated between 1 million and 800, but it's been consistent. We basically have 800,000 jobs that we cannot fill. And a lot of this is complicated with an H-2B visa process that's tied into a visa complication with overall immigration reform in this country. It's an important one. Well, why is this a silver lining? We had these jobs that we couldn't fill, which means hotels were running overtime because we didn't have enough people. So any kind of layoffs or furloughs, even though they're impactful to the employees that are there, they're not as deep as they could be because we didn't have all these employees already employed. As an industry, again, everything is pocketed by hotels, but as an industry, that's the issue. And because we don't have enough labor and because wages are growing, by the way, pricing or wages in hotels have grown at 4.7%. Number one cost to any hotel is labor. Number one cost. So it means our number one expense in the hotel industry has grown at almost 4.7%. And the reason this matters, when you look at this, the blue bar shows you the increase in labor costs for the hotel industry every year. And this green line shows you our ability to grow RevPAR, or rooms revenue. Rooms revenue is where we make our profit. We really don't make our profit in other areas. It's rooms revenue that drives that. So you can see, and this was from STAR, only 9 of the top 25 markets grew enough revenue to actually support the increase in labor. That is where hotels were. So we were already at a little bit of a crossroads before this hit from a cost standpoint. And I think that's important for you just to know. There's a lot of conversation when you're talking to hotels and planning meetings around cost and concessions. This is what's driving it, that our costs are rising at an alarming rate because of labor at the end of the day. And that's not to say poor hotels, it's just to explain what's going on in these environments because they're tough environments. The other thing when I look at the overall economy is this was Q4 GDP around the world. You can see nobody was on fire to begin with. Everybody had kind of slowed down. Japan was already receding. The US and South Korea were the only ones growing. So GDP around the world was either flat or declining. World projections from the World Economic Forum this year, it showed you global GDP is still expected to grow at about 3%. Where there is a split, and it's important to understand, it's the advanced economies that have slowed down. You know who that is? China, us, and Europe. Guess who's growing is all the emerging markets. Africa, India, and others are still growing. That's the important part to the global picture, which means there is some hope because some of these secondary markets have not been heavily impacted with COVID-19. So there is some hope that those markets will continue to grow, and we're hoping China kind of gets up and going. These are the latest forecasts on the declines of GDP and world GDP from COVID-19. They're going to get more severe, by the way. These are going to get a little bit deeper. But even as of March, the overall impact was looking at 0.5% of GDP. Even if that grows to 1.5%, it doesn't mean we've fallen off the cliff. It just means we have a lot of work to do to make up. And that is going to be more information coming out as we go. I'm not going to talk about the dollar. I want to talk about China. Look, China already, before this started, had its lowest GDP they had seen in 25 years. And that has been a challenge for the Chinese economy. It had already been slowing down. That's why global growth was starting to be questioned, because a lot of it's being driven by China. And then you had COVID-19, and this is the issue. Why did China matter so much? This is their manufacturing index, and you can see it fell off the cliff in February. Now, why did it fall off the cliff? Because they are one of the largest manufacturers in the world, and we all depend on them. And the reason this is interesting is when you look at China, they actually control almost 29% of all manufacturing in the world. Guess who's number 2? The United States. And that is why manufacturing has been such a big discussion here in this country. But China is number 1. So why does that matter? Because of all places for this to be ground zero, Wuhan is one of the major manufacturing arms for China. So when this broke out in Wuhan, you couldn't have picked a worse place for this to break out in China. When they shut down those factories, when they shut down production, unfortunately that impacted automotive and technology in this country. There are discussions, and they're saying when Apple is telling you that 90% of their product comes from China, they may rethink this after this episode. Because do you ever want this to be the case again, that you're so leveraged into one area that one area can shut you down? There's probably going to be some thought about manufacturing around the globe, spreading manufacturing around the globe. I think that could be a silver lining at the end of it for a lot of different countries, including the United States when it's all said and done. But COVID-19, look, we know what the world map looks like. I want to show you. These are the global numbers as of this morning. We have 189,000 cases. What isn't always spoken about as much is we've had 80,000 people fully recover. There's more recoveries coming. It takes 14 days for that number to show up. So it takes a little bit of lag time in it. When you look at that is the current map of all cases around the world. I think it's a great visual, but 10,000 plus cases is the dark red that you see highlighted there. That's China. Then 1,000 to 999 is kind of the red, and that's where the United States is right now. So we're in that second tier, but China is still the hotbed out of this. And I'm going to show you Europe is the major concern. And Europe is a real problem in this. This is a Johns Hopkins. I go to their site every day. You can just see they actually tally all the numbers, and these are total confirmed, these are total deaths, these are recoveries. They start to show you all the different trend lines in one area, and that's an important one to understand. I am not discounting the severity of the disease. When I talk about perspective, and I keep saying Governor Cuomo has done such an excellent job of every day at his press conference trying to tell everybody that the fear is outpacing the facts, that the fear is worse than the virus at this moment. And he's not saying it's not serious. He's coming from one of the more serious areas in New York that they're dealing with. His point is the fear is overrun, and it doesn't match with what they're dealing with. And that's an important one. So when I talk about perspective, 180,000, we keep showing this number as it grows. That number's always going to grow. Active cases is 100,000, not 180, because you have to subtract the people, and actually less than that. You have to subtract the people that have died and the people that have recovered, to know what are the active cases open. And the active cases are much smaller than that number. That number is always going to grow because it's every new case that's being added to it, but it doesn't tell you where the situation is. And even with the number of total cases, and again, I'm not discounting any life, but 189,000 people impacted. There's 7.7 billion people on the planet when I talk about perspective. And even when you look at populations, 80,000 people in China is a big number. They have 1.7 billion people that live there. It is a very small percentage of the overall population. Yes, we need to stop the spread. Yes, we need to flatten the curve, everything we're doing. I'm just talking about perspective when you're looking at this. And that's what Governor Cuomo keeps calling for. Just, can we have some perspective on what this looks like? You know, New York has 1,000 cases. New York has 11 million people that just live in Manhattan alone, and it's 1,000 cases. And they do think they can control it with the work that they're putting into place right now. The other piece I will look at, you keep talking about these curves or hearing about these curves. What I wanted to point out, these two numbers are what's gotten everybody all excited. It's Italy and Spain. But I wanted to point out, when you look at what happens in the US, when you look at what's happened in France and in Germany and even in South Korea, this is the flattening of the curve. It's not going up anymore. It's starting to flatten out and it will start to decline. That's the important part when they talk about the curve line. It's an epidemic curve. It has a life cycle. You know what the life cycle was in China? 2 months. They're now 3 months into it. They talked about the country is 99% completely back to work and rolling. They only had 20 new cases reported last night in China. 19 of the cases were because people were traveling back into the country. Only one communal case as far as a new case in China. That's an important piece of the puzzle, which means their cycle ended in 90 days. When you've heard in press conferences what's the timing of this, you're talking about a 2 to 3 weeks, which should put us at the spike, and we should be on the back end of this curve. We should be on the bell side of this curve when it's all said and done. And that puts us, if you got into a 90-day window, that means by June or July, no more cases or very few cases being reported. It doesn't mean we're waiting till June and July to start getting back to some normalcy. It just means those trend lines are already there. When you look at these freakouts, Italy is the worst problem around the world right now. And Italy is alarming. From March 5th until today, they've almost had 12,000 new cases. They've doubled their cases, and that's what's freaking everybody out. Italy has some uniqueness that not a lot of people are talking about. Italy has the oldest population in Europe. It also has the oldest population as a percentage of overall population of anyone in the world. It has one of the highest rate of respiratory disease because of the smoking that goes on in Italy. And they also have a cultural issue for this disease. It's not an issue, but for this disease, they have a cultural issue in that families live together, including grandma and grandpa with larger families, all in big houses. So the spread is more rampant because they're all together. That is what has gotten out of hand. The mortality rate in Italy, by the way, is almost 10%. You haven't heard that anywhere else in the world. It's because of the older population with underlying health issues. Not just that they're older, it's that they have an underlying health issue that's making the mortality rate so high. I'm trying to stress that because that's the scariness around it when you see the number. I'm also a numbers geek. I get into the data. And I took a look at, if you remove Wuhan, by the way, Wuhan was almost at 4%. The rest of China had a 1% mortality rate once they understood what they were dealing with. And if you start to look at the pockets of this, the mortality rate is much smaller when you remove ground zero and you remove Italy, that is really pushing that number up. And you keep hearing all the doctors tell you when they have these press conferences with the government, they'll tell you that they know that number is going to get smaller because the denominator will get bigger. We're going to identify more cases of people that will recover or people that had the virus and didn't even know it, because there are certain people that you won't even have any symptoms and you'll move on, or you'll have very light symptoms like a cold and didn't know you had the virus. That's the issue. Look, my daughter works in a hospital and she can't get tested because she has no symptoms. And they don't want her being tested until you have symptoms. And that is kind of the issue we're dealing with right now. Once we get into these, you're hearing about, we're going into drive-through testing. We're going to have at-home testing. If we can do that, That's going to be really good because we can test a larger population very quickly. The reason they're telling you not to get tested until you have symptoms, that's what's overrunning the ERs. That's what's overrunning the hospitals, that somebody gets the sniffles and they're running to the ER to go get tested for coronavirus. It's like you have a cold or you have allergies. Unless you have these specific symptoms, you shouldn't be running because that's taking away medicine and medical time from people that actually need it. That's kind of what we're struggling with right now. This is Europe, and again, when you look at Italy, 27,000 cases and 2,000 fatalities. And when you look at serious, this means in the hospital, 1,800 that are serious. It's the worst in all categories. But you can look at other parts of Europe, like the UK. They only have 55 people that have deceased, 52 recovered. Again, they're earlier in their cycle, but they only have 20 serious. They only have 20 people that have been hospitalized because of it. That's a much better trend line than what you're seeing in Italy or France. This is the important side of it. And when you get to the United States, or this is still world numbers, what I wanted to show you when we talk about these epidemic curves, this was all China on the first half of it. And you can see China started to ramp up. The red are new cases, the green are recoveries. And you can see they kind of hit the spike and then they started to slow down. And literally theirs started way back in December 31st was the first case. So you're talking about their spike ending by mid-February. That is the 2-month cycle. What you're seeing right now is our spike around the world. Our spike around the world, we're right here where China was. And it's a little more sporadic, but again, we're in the middle of our cycle. We just got to get through the other side of it. And this spike right here is really being driven by Europe. I'm going to show you another chart that shows you that. And this is the important part. Here's the US numbers. We're up to 5,000 cases, New York being the worst. New York has 1,300, but you will see on this chart, 12 deceased, 60 serious. The numbers of serious that are in the hospital are very small. You can see state by state, we have very few that are in the hospital right now. You have very few that are deceased outside of Washington, and Washington was the big piece of it. Remember that of their 48, 22 came from a nursing home that they couldn't get under control. And that is why you're hearing the announcements about nursing homes today. It's about let's stop visitors for a short period of time so that we can make sure that the most at-risk population are protected. Because it's not them getting sick in the nursing home, it's us bringing it in to a nursing home that's going to get them sick. So that is what they're trying to isolate right now. This just shows you again, it's a different look of it. The blue is all China. The orange is the rest of the world. You can see China went through their spike and then they started to come down into very few cases. We're in the middle of our spike right now. We're just in the middle of our cycle. And I think the cycle helps you see it, that this is a cycle. It's the same cycle every country has faced that's seen it. This is South Korea's cycle. Like I said, it looks like a bell curve. It spikes and then it slows down. That is what the government is trying to do right now. They're saying, hey, if we can take a 2-week time out, we can slow this down even faster and then all get back to work. That is kind of the hope when it's all said and done. Now this chart is all cases outside of Europe. Outside of China. What I wanted to point out, this orange is Europe. It is the largest spike that you were seeing. The Americas is right here. This is where the Americas are falling. And what the government is trying to do right now is to make sure we don't end up here. That is why it seems extreme. They're trying to say, how do we not become Europe when it's all said and done? And let's make sure we learn the lessons we learned from them out of the gate. But you can see Europe is the problem. Everywhere else around the world, yes, there's outbreaks, but it's moderate. It's Europe that's really pushing this. This is the World Health Forum, just telling you what is going on. This is something that over the weekend, I'm that kind of person. I'm thinking about, okay, something doesn't make sense because the panic we feel, the over news cycle we feel just seemed extreme. So I went back and tried to do some research and homework, and I was looking at, everybody talks about SARS, but in the United States, what was more impactful was H1N1, which was 2009. It was the swine flu. Some of you may have gotten it, but who talks about the swine flu today? We didn't shut down the industry. We didn't shut down the country, and I'm not saying we shouldn't. That's not my point. I'm trying to figure out why the panic is so different. Us as a population, we weren't making runs on grocery stores like we are today. And what's interesting is I went back and looked at this. Do you know in the swine flu, 60 million Americans were infected and 12,000 people died? 60 million Americans were infected with the swine flu. It was the worst severe epidemic we've seen, much more severe than SARS. SARS was globally impactful, not US impactful. And what's interesting is I went back and looked at this, and infected worldwide were 700 million to 1.4 billion, according to the World Health Organizations, with fatalities that ranged anywhere between 150,000 to 500,000 people from the swine flu. And again, the freak out didn't feel like this. And one of the things I looked at is, it's interesting, today 2/3 of Americans get their news from social media. And what's interesting is I went back and looked at this. Back in 2009, Facebook only had 305 million active viewers monthly, or active users. Today, it's 2.5 billion. Twitter only had 30 million monthly. Today, it's 330 million. What's changed is how quickly information is spread. And again, it's bite-sized information, it's headlines, and we don't read or get the rest of the context of the story. I also looked at SARS was talked about, media impressions. Google News did a survey, or did an analysis. Media mentions of SARS back in 2009, 53 million. You know how many mentions we've had of coronavirus or COVID-19 since this thing started? 1.1 billion. That's the issue of in our face completely. I do think we turned a corner. Watching all news cycles today, you know what they're talking about? The economy. They weren't talking about the epidemic anymore. They're talking about the economy, what's going to come, and what that looks like. That is a good turn in news cycle because we won't keep getting pounded about the coronavirus and what's going on. And I even saw today on Squawk Box or on CNBC, when they were showing, every day they were showing the numbers. Today they quoted the numbers and didn't show it. They just talked a quick update on it. They told you where we were on total count, total recoveries, fatalities, and they moved on. That's a different cycle than we've been seeing over the last 2 months. And hopefully that'll be good for our psyche. I'm going to pass this, and we're going to get into disruption when we get into the rest of it. I'm going to come back and talk about leadership, and that's really about disruption and what that looks like today. But I hope this gives you some context about what's happening. I'm not, and believe me, I keep getting beat up by certain people sometimes because I'm trying to be a voice of reason and not panic, but that doesn't mean I don't take the situation seriously. And there's a balance there. But just because it's a serious situation does not mean we cannot put context around this to make sure that we have a proper frame of reference to know what this looks like. You know, people need to quit rushing the stores. We do not have a shortage of product anywhere in the United States. There is no reason to rush the stores the way we're rushing the stores. It's irrational. And yes, I blame the media for that. Because the media needs to be telling everybody, you don't need to rush the stores. And all experts will tell you, if you're really worried about everything falling off a cliff, you need to be buying canned goods, not produce. Yeah, that's what everybody's, and the toilet paper, I will never understand. I do not get it. I've never heard of the runs being a symptom of this situation. That one is beyond me. So thank you for your time. I hope that brings some context to this, and then we'll talk about leadership in just a bit. Thank you.